today's news.
Hello and welcome to Old News, the programme and podcast which looks at news stories of the day through the papers of yesterday. This week, Market Square in Castletown. Been back in the news quite recently about the recent debate about whether it should be closed off, the main part of the square, throughout the winter as well as the summer months, be pedestrianised. Certainly looks lovely in the summer. Quite what you do there in the winter, who knows, but I think that has been the decision. Sent me scrabbling back through the virtual papers, in any case, to see what we can see. Well, I'm going back to 1915 to start, Saturday, August the 14th to be exact, when we are told that owing to the unfavourable weather, the patriotic demonstration in Castletown Market Square was not held on Saturday evening as arranged. Oh dear. On Sunday afternoon and evening, Miss M. Ratcliffe, evangelist, conducted services in the Town Hall, Castletown, in aid of the funds of the Queen Street Mission, the collections realising over £2. Quite a lot of money probably in 1915. Miss Ratcliffe's powerful sermons were greatly appreciated. Colonel G. Moore, HK, also gave a short address at the evening meeting when the hall was well filled. You can't quite imagine that happening now, can you? At a special meeting of Castletown Commissioners, we're told in the same piece, the following ladies and gentlemen were appointed enumerators for the purpose of the National Registration Act, followed of course by a list of names. Whereas sadly, we also told the monthly meeting of the Southern District Higher Education Board was called for Thursday evening at Castletown, but as there was not a quorum of 7 members in attendance, no business could be transacted. Meanwhile, the Castletown War Needlework Guild, 1915 of course, middle of the First World War, a highly enjoyable entertainment in aid of Castletown War Needlework Guild was given in Castle Rushen grounds on Tuesday evening. The castle was open free between the hours of 6 and 7 o'clock, and many persons availed themselves of the opportunity of going through the imposing building. And then a list of people who had helped. Yes, of course, you forget the middle of the war, very different times. We're skipping right the way forward now, or fair way forward in any case, to the Alaman Times of December the 9th, 1950. Parking in Market Square, Castletown. Residents appeal to the local government board. Some interesting problems of parking as to whether the front or the back of the car should face the curb. How interesting is that? And up to what hours it was permissible were discussed during an appeal heard by the local government board on Friday against the new parking place in the Market Square, Castletown, recently appointed by the commissioners. 1950 this was, of course. The appeal was made by Mrs. B. M. Van Smit of the Parade, Castletown, who conducted her own case and had several verbal clashes with Mr. E. Farger, who appeared on behalf of the commissioners. Sounds a feisty soul. Mr. Farger stated that under the Parking Regulations Act 1949, local authorities had the right to appoint parking places. After consideration, Castletown Commissioners had drawn up a list of 12 car parks, to none of which there had been any objection, except in the case of Market Square. There had been a car park there for some years on the other side of the Smelt Memorial. The accommodation, however, was insufficient, and it had been decided to make an additional diagonal path for 21 cars at the side of the square. The commissioners, after hearing Mrs. Van Smith's objection, had decided that the new car park should remain as it was necessary to Castletown and to motorists, and the car park and regulations had been approved by the police. Mrs. Van Smith said the parking arrangements were ruining the square. She had no objection to parking in the centre, where she said it would be just as easy to park back to back as beside the houses. Visitors sometimes parked facing her sitting room windows, oh dear, and sat in their cars eating lunch. Well, it can't be allowed, can it? On one occasion, a lorry full of hides, dripping blood and smelling unpleasant, was parked there for a considerable time, and the constant revving of engines and the smell of petrol caused annoyance to residents from morning to midnight. Well, certainly to Mrs. Van Smith anyway. Mr. Farger said the commissioners had tried out parking in the centre of the road without success. Inspector F. Farragut said he had advised the present parking arrangements in order to accommodate traffic in Arbury Street and Maloo Street, which were too narrow for parking, and the police found it better to have a wide thoroughfare in the middle of the square. Mr. J.R. Corrin, MLC, a member of the board, expressed the opinion that parking of cars in front of good residential houses was not desirable unless it was absolutely necessary, and thought the Market Square was the wrong place for that kind of parking. In the Market Square, he said, you have some of the finest old property in Castletown, which, it should be remembered, was once the capital of the island. Many people have a sentimental interest in Castletown, and I think the Commissioners should try and preserve the amenities of the marketplace. I hope the Commissioners will see to it that the question is taken up and that adequate parking facilities should be found under a scheme for the town's improvement. Now it comes to the nitty-gritty. Park rear to curb. Referring to the question of angular parking, Mr. Farger said the ideal way was for vehicles to be parked with the rear to the curb. Mr. G. Higgins, MLC, another member of the board, said if the car was backed in and the exhaust stained someone's clothes, would the driver be liable for damage? It's a question of our time, it has to be said. Mr. Farger agreed, but said that cars should be parked that way so the driver would have a clear view of the road when driving away. Mr. J.T. Neal, one of the commissioners, said he had been an inspector in Castletown for many years and thought the new parking place was the only solution. The Chief Constable, Major J.W. Young, OBE, said parking in Castletown had been a problem ever since he came to the island, and that the only alternative to this scheme was to keep motorists out of Castletown altogether. Mr. Farger said, as far as he knew, there was nothing to prevent a motorist from parking in the square after midnight, so long as he had his lights on, and the object of the scheme was to prevent parking after midnight. Mr. Corlett, MHK, another member of the board, said cars should not be there then, with or without lights. The Chief Constable said a good many visitors made no attempt to find a garage and left their cars parked overnight. With regard to a suggestion by Mrs. Smith that the Commissioners should give parking in the centre of the square a proper trial, he said a central single line had been tried and not found satisfactory. Mrs. Smith made the alternative suggestion that 2 parking spaces should be eradicated outside her house, as she would. Mr. Farger said the Commissioners might accept a modification of the proposition, but not an amendment such as making the parking in the centre. When Mrs. Smith got up to protest, Mr. Farger said, "Sit down. You have been up and down all the night like a jack-in-the-box." Heavens! "There's no need to be rude," said Mrs. Smith. "Surely we can keep this on a friendly basis." "You have been interrupting too, Mr. Farger," said the chairman. The board stated that they would consider the whole question and give their decision later. Hot stuff, it has to be said, back in 1960 there. But as it was stated at the beginning of the article, it is a fascinating subject. Do you park nose in or nose out? We skip to the Isle Times, Wednesday, June the 1st, 1960. Decorative lighting on Market Square. Castletown proposal depends on government aid, doesn't it always? Castletown Market Square may have decorative lighting if government financial assistance is forthcoming. The Finance Committee of the Commissioners have asked the Tourist Board if they would be prepared to support the application for assistance. It is considered by the Commissioners that in carrying out the scheme, full advantage could be taken of the old trees on the square, which could be decorated with coloured lights and illuminated figurines. Will a market day be instituted in Castletown, it's asked. It's the question on which the general public and local tradespeople will be able to air their views at a special meeting to be held in the Oddfellows Hall, Arbury Street on Friday beginning at 8:30 p.m. Mr. T.H. Colburn, MHK, for the town, who in a recent debate in Tynwald mentioned the matter of the markets, will be present at the meeting, which has been called by the Commissioners. In 1960, the Isle of Man Times, Friday, August the 26th, to happier times, spectacular pageantry in Castletown. Castletown Market Square should be the scene of a spectacular pageantry this evening when the Castletown Festival Queen is due to come through the castle gates at 7:45 p.m, heralded by a fanfare of trumpets from the trumpeters of the Royal Horse Guards Band. Good stuff, eh? She will receive the Douglas Festival Queen, and then together with their attendants, they will move to a special dais in front of the sundial, where they'll be flanked by the Manx Girls and the Wanderers Choirs in their distinctive uniforms. At 7:50 p.m, the band of the Royal Horse Guards will march from the castle, and for the next hour and a half there will be a full programme by the choirs, the Castle Russian dancers with soloists Keith Ennett and Tony Archibald, the Guards Band, the drum majorettes, and outstanding attraction for the younger spectators, the Jive Band of the 3rd American Air Force. Get on it, Grandad. Culmination of the evening's events will be a general procession of all participants in the market square, followed by the beating of the retreat as the lights are progressively dimmed and the flag is lowered on the Eagle Tower of Castle Rushen. The American and British national anthems will be played by the massed bands. Sounds like a good night, doesn't it? Jiving to the Royal Air Force bands. In the Alabama Examiner, Thursday, August the 25th, 1960, we hear we're all set for the Tattoo, the visit of the famous band. So I think we're talking about the same event here, realistically. Given fine weather, the display in the Castletown Market Square tomorrow evening will be spectacular. I think it would be. And indeed, the band of the Royal Horse Guards and the US 3rd Air Force Jiving Band will be there. The dry moat of Castle Rushen will be used as the assembly ground, and the entrances of the bands and other units taking part will be made through the castle gates into the square. Trumpeters are to be stationed, we're told, on the castle walls, and the lowering of the flag on the Eagle Tower, the highest point of the castle, is to be a high point in the programme. Lavish use of floodlighting and decorative lighting in the square and on the castle is being arranged. Does sound like quite a spectacular. I can't imagine something like that happening now, can you? And then we go to 1961, when it's still going strong, a colourful scene in Castletown Square, according to the Daily Times of Tuesday, May the 16th. There was a magnificent scene in the Castletown Market Square on Saturday when the Norwegian choir Songlaget of Oslo visited the town. Before a very large audience, the choir formed up in front of the Smelt Monument and sang a number of Norwegian songs which delighted the townsfolk. The bright sunshine, the colourful national dresses of the ladies of the choir, and the big crowd with the castle as a background made a fine spectacle. After their performance in the square, the choir was entertained to tea in the town buildings by the commissioners. I'm sure they loved that. They were welcomed by Mr. Dick Kegg, vice-chairman of the board, who mentioned that the island had the Vikings to thank for the parliamentary system. They've got a lot to answer for, haven't they? In reply, the leader of the choir presented the town with a silver-mounted pennant of the Norwegian flag and said while she was always somewhat ashamed of the dreadful things the Vikings did, she was glad to know they'd done some good in the Isle of Man. Well, that's one way of looking at it. The choir thoroughly enjoyed the meal which was provided by the Castletown Women's Institute. It included traditional Manx fare, such as bonnig and soda cake, which the visitors greatly relished. The Institute was also responsible for the very attractive floral decorations in the hall. They also produced a magnificent cake, which was decorated with Tynwald Hill and the Manx flag above it and the Norwegian fjords with the Norwegian flag on it. About 100 people were served with the tea, and at the conclusion the choir sang a traditional Norwegian song which expresses thanks for the providing of hospitality. The Women's Institute was thanked for their fine effort by Mr. Kegg, and Mr. Harry Pickard thanked the commissioners. 1961 in the Daily Times. Well, they do have a lot to answer for, the Vikings, don't they? One way or another. But there again, we certainly wouldn't have Tynwald without them. Whichever way you look at it, the Market Square has been around for some time. Perhaps it doesn't feature quite as much in the papers as one might think, but of course, whichever way you look at it as well, it's always old news. Until next time, cheerio.
You're gonna be yesterday's news.